Lord, thank you for this good day and your love and mercy. Lord, thank you for the confidence we have of knowing that you are in control of all things. Lord, even when it seems that um, things are going astray, Lord, we know that you are in control. Father, I pray that you would be with us tonight and pray that you'd quicken our minds and our hearts. Pray that you'd bless Jeffrey and ask your blessings upon this evening. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right. Well, this is our second session, and we will be finishing up on the book C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Good Society. Hopefully you have the outline that we sent out, and you can follow along if you'd like to take notes. Now, beginning next week, we'll go directly into the book we just recently published, and that is American Crisis, Cultural Marxism and the Culture War. And it's a very in-depth, detailed study of the origins of America's culture war. Some of the issues were the ominous issues that we're facing in America today, where it came from, where the controversy came from, and certainly the effects and the consequences of America's culture war. And the last three chapters really, the last three chapters of the book really turned the focus toward what we as Christians can do in response. And of course, nowhere in Scripture does it promise us a problem-free life. And of course, throughout most of Christian history, true Christians have oftentimes been under intense pressure and much suffering. In America, we have been, as you know, uniquely blessed. In many respects, I'd say the United States is probably the greatest nation in all of human history, founded on principles of freedom and all that are very seriously under attack, as you know, today. And so there's no assurance that things will continue in the future as they've been in the past. And so we need to be prepared as Christians to take advantage of the freedom that we do have, but there's no assurance that that's going to continue. But regardless, we are to be courageous and faithful in standing up for the cause of Christ. But as Rod Dreher wrote in his book a couple of years ago, The Benedict Option, especially if the secular left does prevail in this culture war, which very likely could happen, there will be entire professions in which Christians will be excluded. Certain areas of education, certain areas of the medical profession, and so on, that Christians will be excluded from because of our moral and ethical beliefs and so on. So anyway, this is a course for Christians who take their faith seriously and are very concerned about the spiritual and the social, the cultural, and by the way, the political condition of America. And as you know, this is a very critical time in our nation's history. This upcoming election is the most critical, I believe, in our entire history, because what we have in play here are two diametrically opposing worldviews. And if you watched the Republican convention last week and the Democratic convention the previous week, I think the contrast was so crystal clear. This is virtually two worldviews, two irreconcilable, two contradictory worldviews that are clashing. And so those naive people who say, well, we just need to, be nicer to one another, and we need, and we just need to try and work together more and that sort of thing. They don't understand. They don't have a clue, apparently, what's at stake here. This is two totally different value systems. And so we need to take that seriously. And you know, the moral and the spiritual influences of the past are very quickly dissolving in America. There are these insidious forces at work that are literally hell-bent on destroying anything good and decent that remains in our society and culture. And the result is that America has become increasingly immoral, increasingly chaotic, increasingly dysfunctional to an extent that was absolutely unimaginable just a few years ago. And I mentioned last week this quote from R.C. Sproul in one of his books called Life Styles. And in that book, R.C. Sproul writes, I doubt that there's ever been a period in all of Christian history when so many Christians are so ineffectual in terms of shaping the culture in which they live, as is true right now in the United States of America. I fear that he's absolutely correct. And what's desperately needed today, I believe, is an expanded concept of Christian discipleship, a vision for discipleship that is far beyond just personal piety, that extends into all areas of life. And in conjunction with that, what we need is a new Christian consciousness and a holistic understanding of discipleship, not this narrow view of Christian discipleship, such as is oftentimes presented in Bible studies or in churches and so on. So the question is really this, our challenge is this, will we as Christians rise up and meet the challenges that we're facing today, or will we just meekly submit and go with the flow? Will we exhibit the necessary faith and the necessary courage to confront these absolutely ominous forces that are corrupting every aspect of our society and culture? Or are we so acculturated? Are we so compromised? Are we so caught up in the values and the priorities and the agenda of this world as to have so little time and energy and resources left for the things that truly do matter? And so that, stated very succinctly, is the essential message, I think, of our course. And again, I'm very grateful that you are joining us. And I think you'll find it to be a very, the content very rich. I hope it will expand your understanding of how we got into this situation and what we can do to become a greater source of light and love, hope, and truth in our society and culture. So with that, I'd like to transition to the PowerPoint presentation that we started last week on C.S. Lewis on politics and the good society. So Bruce gave me a pretty good tutorial on this, as has Andrea, but let's see how educable I truly am as I attempt to bring this up. Okay, is that visible on your screen? The Areopagus. Okay, all right. So this is sort of our pictorial related to our Areopagus ministry, and some of the symbols that characterize a lot of the issues that we specialize in with the Areopagus. We do a lot with history, Christian history, and regular history. We do a lot with Christian apologetics. You see the photo there in the upper right-hand corner of Francis Schaeffer, probably the most influential cultural apologist of the 20th century. And then, of course, the bibliology book. And as I mentioned, Kathy will be doing a short course on canonization, biblical canonization, beginning in January. some of the other images that more or less depict our major emphases. And at the bottom, of course, C.S. Lewis, and so on. So seminars and forums, biblical studies, Christian history, apologetics, contemporary cultural issues, or cultural apologetics, Christian spirituality, literature and the arts, and so on. So here we are, C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Good Society, based on this book. And we started off with this image last week. Many of you would recognize this immediately. You probably did last week. This is, of course, the Korean Peninsula. And the point here is that politics matters. Politics has a lot to do with the quality of people's lives. You see North Korea, a horrible communist regime, virtually blackened out at night, and then the stark contrast between the North and the South, where there's considerably more freedom and democracy. And so if we truly love others, as we've been commanded by Christ to do so, then we have to take an active interest in politics, social issues, and cultural issues, and so on. All right, so we began last week with the preface, and basically the Pharisee asking Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus responding, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the question, of course, is how can you really love others if you're indifferent toward, apathetic and indifferent toward the kind of laws and public policies and programs that regulate and oftentimes control their lives? How can we possibly love others unless we're sensitive to not only their religious life and their spiritual life, but also we need to be attentive, obviously, to people's physical needs, their material needs, their emotional, social, intellectual, and creative needs as well. And of course, how can we love others if we're indifferent toward laws and public policies? We can't, really. And then again, why did such a brilliant Christian thinker as C.S. Lewis, who wrote so extensively on so many issues that matter, why did he have so little interest in politics and government? It's a good question. And the answer is he didn't. He didn't have little interest. In fact, he was keenly interested in these issues. He understood just how vitally important these matters are. So here we have C.S. Lewis, who I would regard as the foremost Christian thinker and writer of the 20th century. I do a presentation on the 20 most significant, influential Christians in history. And I would include C.S. Lewis in that list of the 20 most significant, influential Christians in all of history. I also call him the preeminent sage of the 20th century, as I mentioned last week. The word sage is not a word that comes up very often. And the reason is there's not much reason to use that word. Sages are, to say the least, few and far between. But here's somebody who has an enormous breadth of knowledge and depth of knowledge in the humanities. And of course, all of this is filtered through Christ-centered wisdom. And a great scholar, philosopher, apologist, theologian, author, of course. And again, in the year 2000, Christianity Today published a list of the most influential Christian books of the 20th century. Lewis's books were numbers 1, 2, and 3 on the list. Mere Christianity, one of my 2 favorite books, by the way, Chronicles of Narnia and the Screwtape Letters. So we talked about how that Lewis stands out because he's quite disinterested in secondary and trivial issues. His primary focus is on what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. And I know many of you have been very involved in Christian apologetics over the years. And you know that in Christian apologetics, The focus is primarily on what is true, the truth of the Christian faith. Now, as far as the goodness of the Christian faith, well, that comes up in certainly in apologetics, but also in theology and philosophy and biblical studies, of course. Now, the one area that's oftentimes been regrettably ignored is the issue of beauty. And Lewis had a very, very keen appreciation for that as well. And not just things that, of course, are physically attractive, but beautiful in the fullest sense. So he's the prototypical everyman of the 20th century. He grows up in a nominally Christian family, but by the time he's a teenager, he is rejecting Christianity, and he is becoming, in his mind, a young intellectual. And of course, in his mind, that means that he's a virtual atheist and a skeptic of religion. Well, he finds that that does not suffice, to say the least, in terms of providing a foundation, a basis for living a quality life. And so he turns to romantic idealism, and that is searching for beauty in this world and beauty in life and so on, since atheism really offers nothing to fulfill that need. But romantic idealism also makes no sense if there's not some transcendent force that's prevalent, that's at work in the world. And so that leads Lewis into the realization that there must be a spiritual reality in life. Life cannot be reduced exclusively to only physical, material properties. And so he begins dabbling in the occult. And this opens him up to the realization that there is a spiritual realm. Now, he also has to, in his mind, settle the issue of why are there powerful forces, seemingly both for good and for evil. And he will eventually conclude, as the Manichaeans in ancient times did, and that is, well, there must be two gods. There must be a good God and an evil God. And apparently neither one is superior in power to the other. They're constantly wrestling and fighting for dominance. And so that's Manichaeism. But the more he thinks about these matters, the more he realizes that that's not a plausible solution either. And we go into the details, of course, in other courses. But it finally leads him to the realization that there is, in fact, just one God. And that is the concept of theism. And so for several years, he holds to a generically theistic understanding of reality, but he is not yet a Christian. And in fact, he does not become a Christian until he's 33 years old. Okay. So Lewis, the prototypical, quote, everyman of the 20th century. What Lewis is concerned about primarily when it comes to Christianity are what we would call the core beliefs and principles of Christianity, the doctrines that you see there on the screen. He's not so much interested in the variations that different denominations and different churches hold. Those really go into the realm of secondary issues. But the primary issues, the core issues, are those that are addressed in the early creeds and have essentially been the defining features of Christian faith. And
Jeff,
so,
can I ask a question?
yes, please.
I was just curious from the last slide. I don't mean to get you backing up in slides, but that whole development of C.S. Lewis over his lifetime. Yeah, that's it. Is that something which is generally accepted by Lewis scholars, or is it? You know, I don't know where it stands in the Lewisian scholarship world.
I would say that among Christians, Christian philosophers, Christian apologists, and so on, Christians who try to treat Lewis's life with respect and honesty, I'd say that it's pretty generally accepted. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Thank you.
he pretty much touches, if you look here, I mean, he touches most of the bases. You might say, well, one thing that looks like it's missing from this would be Eastern pantheistic monism. In other words, Eastern religion, Buddhism, Hinduism. And no, he was very keenly interested in that as well. And that was part of that exploration of pantheism and so on that eventually led to Manichaeism. So
I'd be more likely to say the problem was he touched all the bases.
yes. So he, yeah, well put. So I probably could have also included in this list Eastern religions, because he did find them very, very interesting. They just were not satisfying. They didn't answer the core questions. So if you look here,
Augustine, one of the greatest philosophers of the early Christian era, was a Manichaeist in his early years. So this is not unusual. This is not something which we came up out of nowhere. This is something that's been present in the Christian community for many generations.
Yeah, for serious seekers after truth, yeah, this is not unique to somebody like C.S. Lewis. Yeah, you're right. Now, if you look at this list of core Christian doctrines, Lewis would tell us in Mere Christianity, this is what must be believed if one is to properly define himself or herself as a, quote, Christian. In other words, Christianity has an objective meaning. It's not purely subjective. In other words, we can't just pick and choose certain things to believe and leave off the rest. Christianity is not a smorgasbord religion. And so this is the core. This is what Lewis would call mere Christianity. We would call this basic Christianity. And as he says, that is Christianity. That is what must be believed. Now, he's a man of great character, as attested by many of those who knew him very well in his life, including Douglas Gresham here, who was his adopted stepson. And Gresham, who grew up from late childhood through his teenage years, grew up living with Lewis, says that C.S. Lewis was the finest man and the best Christian I've ever known. And again, as I mentioned last week, what a great testimony. Someone growing up in your household, in your family, and years later saying you were the best Christian they've ever known in their life. So high praise, to say the least. Well, again, we use this term of C.S. Lewis being a great sage. Is there anybody else that would come to mind? Well, there have been some outstanding people in the 20th century, of course. And here's three that are very notable. G.K. Chesterton, very influential on Lewis's Christianity. Lewis basically learned his apologetics from G.K. Chesterton. Also, of course, we have great examples of Christian, in terms of a great Christian thinker and writer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of course. Here's a couple more. William F. Buckley, who we think mostly is a political thinker, but also a serious Catholic Christian. Malcolm Muggeridge. Here is Francis Schaeffer. Many of you are familiar with Richard John Newhouse. Here we have Robert George, one of the great Christian thinkers of our time today. And so there are others that are very, very admirable. But in my mind, Lewis really sort of stands out among them all. Now, what's significant, he's not a professional philosopher. He's not a professional theologian. He's not a professional Bible scholar or historian or psychologist or social scientist, but when he writes on these topics, he does so with great clarity and insight. We began looking last week, and we'll rush through this section on natural law, the moral foundation for good government. And I said that Lewis's ideas on natural moral law come primarily, not exclusively, but primarily from his book, The Abolition of Man. It really serves as the foundation for his political philosophy. It's also a very keen critique of the philosophical and moral decline of the West. And he starts out with talking about what is natural law. And basically, what we're talking about here has nothing to do with the natural physical laws, of course, that govern the universe, but rather, when you see the term natural law, you might insert in the middle there moral. We're talking about natural moral law or ethical law. And this is a generally accepted standard of self-evident truths regarding right and wrong. Now, they're self-evident because we know intuitively that certain things are right and wrong. Now, even moral relativists who claim that there are no moral absolutes, you notice that they never live their life on that basis. Moral relativists, just as we will, when pressed on the issue, will have to concede that, oh yes, certain things are right and wrong, good, evil, proper, improper, and so on. And so these are things that we know intuitively as a result of being created in the image of God. They are the principles that the Christian philosopher J. Budiashevsky writes. These are principles that we can't not know. We know intuitively that there's a moral structure to the universe, and that moral structure is not just man-made concepts. They're not just ethereal concepts. That moral structure really are the expressions of the character and nature of God. So Lewis says this thing which I call the Tao, using a Chinese term, which others may call natural law, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. And if it is rejected, then all value is rejected. And once we eliminate moral standards, we abolish man as a moral being and as a creature made in the image of God. And the result is not freedom, not liberation. The result is certainly not utopia. The result is dystopia. The result, we might say today, of rejecting the moral law, the result is Portland, Oregon, and the insanity that's going on there. All right. Again, the consequences of rejecting the moral law. And I mentioned last week that in 1963, Bob Dylan wrote one of his best-known songs, The Times They Are A-Changin'. 30 years later, he writes another song featured on another album called Everything Is Broken. So we go from The Times Are A-Changin' in the early 60s to Everything Is Broken in the early 90s. And by the way, we're 30 years beyond that today, aren't we? I can't imagine what the title of a comparable song would be today. All right, so let me move on here. And we looked at, I believe this was the last point that we made last week, natural law, some basic principles. There is a God, or at least some moral structure to the universe to which we are responsible for how we live our lives. Certain attitudes, certain speech, certain actions are objectively right and wrong, regardless of how we feel about them. And that would include the sanctity of human life and the rule of law, which of course is being challenged today in America, and some of the others as you see there. honesty and interpersonal relations, and the principle of reciprocity, a tacit acknowledgement of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and the summary principle, do good and avoid evil. All right. The history of natural law, we don't have time to go into that. Some of the foremost articulators of natural law principles early on were the great moral philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, in particular Aristotle. Christian applications, natural law is exactly what the Apostle Paul is referring to in the first chapter of Romans. And of course, that concept is further developed by Augustine several centuries later. And then, of course, the premier theologian and philosopher of the medieval era is Thomas Aquinas. Protestants also, of course, pick up on the idea of natural law and promote it as well. Martin Luther, John Calvin, other great Protestant theologians. And in modern times, John Locke, who so influenced Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and so on. And of course, also this issue came up in the Senate hearings over the confirmation of Clarence Thomas. And we talked about how that Martin Luther King understands this principle, and he will be a staunch advocate of natural law. And you see, you express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws, and that's certainly legitimate, because we urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954, which desegregated schools. It may seem paradoxical that here in Birmingham in 1963, King and the civil rights movement are consciously breaking laws. And so the question comes up, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying other laws? And King zeroes in on the issue. He says, well, the answer lies in the fact there's two kinds of laws. There are just laws and unjust. And of course, we must obey just laws. We have a moral responsibility to do so. And then in the next paragraph, so what's the difference between the two? And how do we determine if a law is just or unjust? And King will write that a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law, on the other hand, is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. And he quotes St. Thomas Aquinas. An unjust law is a human law that's not rooted in eternal law and natural law. And any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. So if you've never read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, I would certainly encourage you to do so. It's so eloquent. He was so articulate, but also his thinking is so sharp and clear in this particular work. All right. Now, the idea of objective, absolute, natural, moral laws, of course, has come under a tremendous amount of criticism, not just in recent decades, but going all the way back to the late 1800s. For the last 150 years, this concept of natural law has been under attack by those who typically would describe themselves as legal positivists. And this is the idea that there are no absolutes and that we just make up all this stuff as we go along as a human society. And laws need to be based on people's preferences. And people's preferences change over time, so the laws need to change over time. that's basically this pragmatic utilitarian concept that is called legal positivism. And advocates would include the ACLU. Probably the most influential early voice in terms of opposition to natural law was the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the late 1800s and early 1900s. All right, so C.S. Lewis on natural law. And again, as I say, natural law is really the moral foundation for civility and decency in society. Natural law has totally broken down in our time, and we see the effects on the news every evening. Let me just pause briefly. Is there anything that could use some clarification, and then we'll quickly move on?
Hey, Jeffrey, if I may.
Yes.
I mean, I just finished. I thought I had read Budziszewski's What We Can't Not Know many years ago, but obviously I had not, because we had a totally untouched copy in the house. But it really is one of them, and you've mentioned it in your notes so far, one of the most powerful discussions of the natural law that I've ever heard. And it's there's so many indications of the fact that this is true that it's hard to understand. Think of the stories that you've heard about people who got away with a crime and years later went back and confessed to the police, or people who are driven to distraction by the fact that they committed some violation of the natural law early in their lives. And Budziszewski goes into a much longer discussion of this and how this affects us. And sometimes we are aware that we're guilty, and because we are aware we're guilty of having violated a natural law, which is written on the heart, oddly enough and seemingly illogically, we commit the same crime again because we feel like we're a bad person, that we need to be punished. And the best, he said the greatest one he heard was someone said, well, you know, a drunk is embarrassed by the fact that he's a drunk, and so he drinks. You know, because we get caught into this stuff and we violate the natural law. There are consequences for it. And Budziszewski lays all this out and makes it really clear how important this stuff is. But it makes me think as a modern, how much you have to deny this sort of stuff in order to be able to go forward and act in a way which is in contravention of the moral law by telling things that are not true and bearing false witness and all of these sorts of issues, how much of a distortion we are in today. And I think that anybody who's interested in this would do well to have a chance to read that and sort of think about it a bit, as it's What We Can't Not Know by Budziszewski.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Another great thinker and writer on natural law is Peter Kraft, who taught for many years philosophy and Christian apologetics at Boston College. And Peter Kraft used to write about how that we think as modern enlightened people that we can basically invent our own morals. And he makes a very compelling case that nobody has ever invented a new moral principle. All we can do is violate or try to negate moral principles as they exist and presumably have existed since the dawn of humanity. Yeah. So, yeah, this is a fascinating field to explore, natural law, and it ought to be just thoroughly integrated into our church education programs. And as I said, this is what's missing today in our civil society. We desperately need to recapture this sense that there are inviolable moral, ethical principles to which we are accountable, whether we like them or not. And one of those, again, would be the rule of law, by the way, and provided they are just laws. All right, now the political philosophy of C.S. Lewis. Here's a letter that he wrote in 1953 to a friend, And Lewis wrote that above all other spheres of human life, the devil claims politics as his own, as almost the citadel of his power. And, you know, I think if we just think back historically, we'd concede he's absolutely right. I mean, people crave power, and in particular political power, so they can control other people's lives. And here's another letter in 1958 in which he writes, government is at best a necessary evil. Now, by the way, what's the key word in that sentence? Well, it's necessary. So government is not is in no way you know, ideal or perfect, but it is absolutely necessary given the realities of human nature. We need laws and government. And here's his son-in-law, Douglas Gresham, who has written, Jack was not interested in politics. Now, if that were the end of the story, this would be a fairly brief lesson this evening, and I wouldn't have had much to write about in the book C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Good Society. But there's more to it than that. But here's one more comment. This comes from his brother, Warney. Jack had contempt, he says, for politics and politicians. So again, that sounds pretty decisive, but in fact, there's much more to be said. Now, what Lewis did not care for are what we would call the nuts and bolts of politics, or the sausage making process of politics. All the backroom wheeling and dealing and negotiations and you know, so on that go on. Lewis had no stomach for that. Here's a letter to Dan Tucker in 1959 in which Lewis writes, now, look, 100 years ago, we all thought that democracy was it. In other words, democracy was the absolute. He says, neither you nor I probably think that now. Democracy always, in the end, destroys education. He was addressing in particular the effects of democracy on education. But as Lewis will later write, democracy is basically a lowest common denominator form of government. Lewis understands that politics often attracts some of the most ambitious, power-hungry, unscrupulous, and manipulative people in all of society. And so temperamentally, Lewis is unsuited for the rough and tumble mud wrestling that is virtually required in democratic politics. Now, he has a different calling. Now, he is an avid voter. He votes very consistently throughout his life. He votes for the Conservative Party because he is very opposed to the Labor Party, which is a socialist party, basically the equivalent of the modern Democratic Party here in America. So Lewis is conscientious in terms of carrying out his responsibilities as a citizen, but he, as I said, had a calling other than getting involved in local politics and so on, which is not a good argument for all of us not being involved. Lewis had a well-defined political philosophy, but it was meta-politics based on the principles of natural law that really interest him. See, he's interested in political theory, not so much the mud wrestling that takes place in politics on a local level. As a moral philosopher and a theoretician, he thought and wrote much on the proper scope and role of government. Again, he's a sage, and this is an integral part of it all. Lewis conceptualizes a comprehensive Christian worldview. And if we do have a comprehensive Christian worldview, then we understand just how vitally important politics and social issues, moral, cultural issues truly are. Now, it's important to note that both metapolitics and political activism are both essential. And again, metapolitics, what I mean by that is political theory. political ideology. If you consider yourself a, quote, conservative by modern American standards, you have certain principles and ideals that you want to hold to. If one were to consider himself a liberal or a socialist, then there's certainly principles and all that they would hold to if they wanted to be consistent. So political philosophy matters, but so does political activism. Now, if we're not engaged and active politically, all we do is concede to oftentimes the most unscrupulous people in society, you know, the whole system. We let them run and control the whole system. Now, metapolitics provides the necessary philosophical guidelines and guardrails regarding the proper role and scope of government. Should government be dictating in specificity exactly how we're supposed to be living our lives today, and using as an excuse to do that the coronavirus pandemic? Well, there's definite limits regarding the proper role and scope of government. Now, otherwise, local politics is strictly pragmatic and driven by politicians' egos, the tyranny of the majority, and the tyranny of the urgent. So it's important to have a well thought out, well-defined political philosophy. And we have many who can help us in that respect, many great political thinkers of the last 200 years and more. Now, political activism is democracy on the national, the state, and the local levels. In lieu of political activism, the very worst politicians and ideas will prevail. You can rest assured that those maniacs out in Seattle and Portland and you know, who are looting and burning and ravaging and savaging our society and culture, you can rest assured those people are going to be voting in November. And, you know, it behooves us to take this very, very seriously. No Christian is above politics. No pastor, no church leader is above politics. If we're not conscientious and involved, then we are conceding the whole process to oftentimes the very worst people in our society. And we use as an example here Saul Alinsky, who was a radical Marxist, probably best known for his book Rules for Radicals. And as you see there, the subtitle, A Pragmatic Primer for Realistic Radicals. And people like Saul Alinsky, of course, have had an enormous influence on American politics over the last 50, 60 years or more. And his influence has been overwhelmingly negative. But if we don't take our responsibility seriously, rest assured there's people who believe and practice most everything that we find to be objectionable. They are going to be very actively involved and so on. And our society and culture will suffer consequences. Now, Lewis writes actually quite a lot on politics, but oftentimes a lot of this is overlooked by C.S. Lewis scholars today. I wasn't aware of just how much he had written until a couple of years ago when I started focusing on it so as to write this book. But here's a few articles and some of his books that are expressly political and highly recommended. I talk about all of these in the book itself, of course. Now, was Lewis really sophisticated in his political ideology? Well, here's one of the great historians of the 20th century, A.J.P. Taylor of Oxford University. And Taylor noted that Lewis actually helped out in the history school at Magdalen College by teaching political history. Now, Oxford University, depending on how you assess such things, one of the great universities in the world, and always has been one of the great universities in the world. And here's one of the great historians of the 20th century, and he concedes that C.S. Lewis actually helped out by teaching political history. He's also not only has a sophisticated understanding of political philosophy, but Lewis has a moral perspective, a Christian moral perspective on all this as well. He is a political sophisticate. He has a very sophisticated understanding of these matters. Now, he writes a work in 1939 called On Bolshevism. This is an article. And in that, he makes the case that Soviet communism and German Nazism are evil twins. Now, you might think, well, okay, so what? I mean, anybody knows that. Well, no, not everybody does know that. And certainly not everybody knew that back in the 1930s. And Lewis is basically making the case, which is a rather obvious one if you think about it in retrospect. These are both tyrannical, totalitarian political philosophies. Now, there are some differences between Nazism and communism, but the similarities they share are far more important than are the differences between them. And so, whereas at a university like Oxford, and here in America, Harvard and Columbia and all these places, a lot of anti-Nazi sentiment was being generated in the 1930s by many of the same people who would give Soviet communism a pass. And you know, that's been the case actually ever since. But Lewis, because he is a moral thinker, he sees these as twin evils. One's no better than the other, except that one of them posed a more direct threat to world civilization back in the 1930s and 40s, and of course that was Nazi Germany. Now, in a work called Bolverism, Lewis will argue that Marxism is a simplistic ideology. It's deterministic and dehumanizing, and although it claims to be based on, quote, scientific socialist principles, in fact, it's merely the product of an angry and bitter secular humanist, Karl Marx. Now, if you've studied the history of left-wing movements and all, you know that back in the 19th century, when Karl Marx was living, there were many varieties of socialism. Now, Karl Marx attempted to delineate his particular branch of socialism by, and he does it in a quite, in a very clever way. He calls his theory scientific socialism, so as to distinguish it from all the other competing socialistic theories of the day. And in doing so, he, you know, basically it's a propaganda coup in calling it scientific socialism. It's very similar to starting a Marxist, racist organization today and calling it Black Lives Matter. Well, of course, Black Lives Matter. All lives matter, you know. But in calling it that, that's a very clever marketing strategy by that organization, which in other respects is an absolutely odious, anti-Christian and anti-American organization. So Black Lives Matter, that's very clever. That's a very clever name for an organization. Scientific socialism was a very clever marketing strategy that Karl Marx used to push his ideology. Now, there's a book called C.S. Lewis on Politics and Natural Law, and the authors Dyer and Watson write, quote, "With an education that is hard to imagine today," and when I teach on the history of on Lewis's life and so on, we go into this in a lot of detail. His quality and level of education was just astonishing. So with an education that's hard to imagine today, Lewis could appreciate the intellectual and philosophical transitions that had transpired from Plato to John Locke to the contemporary theorists of his own day. Lewis was well versed in philosophy and ethics and political thought, including natural law theory as well. An absolutely first-rate education. Now, is politics important? Well, remember, Lewis said it's a necessary evil. But again, the operative word there is it's necessary, given the realities of human nature, because our nature itself is evil. So we need something to counter our natural inclinations and impulses. All man-made systems and institutions are flawed, but obviously some are better than others. Now, think of it, everything that human beings do are shades of gray. None of us is perfect. Nothing that we do is pristine, pure, and perfect. But some systems, some institutions, some ideas, some some thinking and some actions are a whole lot better than others. And part of the challenge of being an adult is the ability to distinguish between shades of gray. Now, I don't know about you, but I have rarely ever in my life voted enthusiastically for a candidate, whether it's president or governor or whatever. But I can assure you, I vote very, very enthusiastically all the time against certain politicians. And so they're all shades of gray, but some are far better than others. I mean, I think anybody that is in touch with reality would have to concede that. And we have a moral responsibility to keep the very worst people out of office. The people who will do the most damage, we need to keep those people out of office. So it's not a matter of voting for somebody who's, the perfect candidate. They don't exist. Now, in other words, in a good society, people would go about their lives with relatively little concern about how the government is operating. That would be nice. But the more corrupt and the more dysfunctional a political system is, the more we have to pay attention, which is why we must be paying close attention today, and frankly, throughout our whole lifetimes, of course. The more corrupt and dysfunctional a political system, the more damage it can do, then the more we must pay attention and be actively engaged and involved. Lewis puts it this way, but do not let us mistake necessary evils for the good. A sick society must think much about politics. To ignore the subject may be fatal, and it may be cowardice. So ours is certainly a sick society, and which requires us to think much about politics. If we're not actively engaged, doing all we can to promote the better options, then that is tantamount, Lewis would say, to fatal cowardice. Now, C.S. Lewis would not have called himself a conservative necessarily in the modern sense of the word. He did refer to himself on several occasions as a, quote, traditionalist. He certainly was not a libertarian. He understands that human nature is very fallible and, in fact, quite flawed. So he is not a libertarian. He's not a Democrat, and I mean Democrat in the small d sense. In other words, he understands that democracy is a lowest common denominator form of government. He's not a Christian socialist. In effect, he believes the calling of a Christian is to be that of a watchman, somebody who observes what's going on and offers a prophetic critique of a biblically based critique of contemporary society and culture. That's primarily what our role is in society, is to be a watchman and provide a prophetic critique of what's going on. But we can't just sit on the sidelines. We also have to be involved, again, promoting the better options over the worse options. Now, Lewis's whole political philosophy is very sensible, it's rational, it's ethical, of course, and it's realistic. And if you look at those three words, he demands that our understanding of politics be rational, certainly moral-based, but also realistic, given, again, the dynamics and the matrix that is human moral, the human moral condition. So his political philosophy, his meta-politics, is based on two major influences. One is natural law ethics, as we were talking about earlier. And the other is the so-called classical liberal ideology of thinkers like John Locke. Now, again, you know, these are man-made terms, as you understand. And so someone who would have called himself a, quote, liberal 200 years ago or 250 years ago has really nothing in common with a modern liberal. Likewise, somebody 200 years ago or 250 years ago who called himself a, quote, conservative would have very little in common with a modern conservative. So again, these are man-made terms, and the meaning of these terms change over time. So when we talk about classical liberalism, what exactly does that mean? Well, it was a political philosophy that emphasized natural rights or unalienable rights, God-given rights, as Thomas Jefferson would write into the Declaration of Independence. Classical liberalism also advocated what we call a social contract theory of government. In other words, government should be the creation of the people, and it should be the servant of the people, not the master, the lord over the people. And it should exist by at least majority consent. Also, classical liberalism.
Jeff, can I interject something?
Okay.
Just how we're changing our words. You know how you're talking about defining government right now? With
Yeah.
all these private, public coming together in everything that we do now, the word is changing from government to governance. And governance means you're being controlled. It isn't of the people anymore.
Yeah.
And and that word is coming up in everything.
Well, that's a good point you make, Mary, and it's basically trying to set the parameters for you know, how we operate and what our rights are and that sort of thing. That's a good point you make. So classical liberalism is based on natural rights, God-given rights, social contract theory, representative government, but not a democracy. Constitutional government, which basically guarantees certain rights, and these should be inviolable. In other words, the importance of the rule of law, which is the next point. Also, limited government, that government has a primary responsibility to provide for the safety and security of its people. That means government has to maintain adequate military resources to defend us from foreign powers that would want to conquer and subdue us. But also government has a responsibility to provide for police protection. Protection against both, foreign enemies as well as domestic enemies as well. And again, when it comes to the role of police and so on, never in American history have we seen that perverted as has been the case just this year. So what is the purpose of government? Well, Lewis says the state exists simply to promote and protect the ordinary happiness of human beings in this life. So that requires that it protect us from enemies, foreign and domestic. And other than that, to provide an environment in which we can flourish within certain parameters, of course, and that is we can't flourish at the expense of others. The implications: the state must defend its citizens from internal and external threats. And furthermore, government officials, even mayors of Portland and Seattle and Washington, D.C. and Chicago and New York City, government officials must abide by the rule of law. Otherwise, it's a dereliction of duty and they should be removed. Now, as I said, Lewis would see himself as a traditionalist. He's certainly not a laissez-faire conservative or a libertarian. In other words, Lewis values morality and tradition, social justice in the true sense of the word, and nature over unrestrained development, science, and technology. And his political philosophy is derived from, again, a rational, an ethical, and a realistic understanding of human nature. See, if we don't understand human nature properly, then we can't possibly design a governmental system or a social system that's going to work advantageously. So we have to understand that human beings have amazing potential for good. We also have amazing potential for evil. And so we are very much a mixed bag. And that being the case, America's founding fathers, for instance, will craft together a system in which people are guaranteed a broad range of rights, but always with the understanding that liberty must be balanced by private virtue and public virtue. And so when we reach a critical mass in America in which most people have forsaken private and public virtue, you see the whole system beginning to crumble and fall apart, as we witness again every evening in the news. Now, here's two basic realities regarding democracy, and I'll be very quick about this because there's more important things to talk about. And for better or for worse, our republic, as it was founded by the founding fathers, our republic eventually morphed into a democracy, but that's a long discussion. But let me just make a few points. Human beings are sinful. That being the case, government is necessary. Madison put it this way: if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But here's the problem, see? Human beings are sinful, but government is staffed by human beings. So the power of government also needs to be controlled. And Madison, again, was a good source. In framing the government, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed. But also, in the next place, you must oblige the government to control itself. And of course, that's a very delicate operation because, as the British historian Lord Acton so eloquently put it, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Government needs to be staffed by sinful human beings. Its powers need to be controlled. John Witherspoon, the great Presbyterian cleric, academic, and one of the great founding fathers of America, put it this way: every good form of government must be complex so that one may check the other. You say, oh, well, that's the kind of system we have. And you'd be quite correct. And these ideas were also articulated by the French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, his famous quote, power checks power. So hence the three divisions of government as originally set forth. Liberty has to be balanced by private and public virtue. Lewis puts it this way: you cannot make men good by law, and without good men, you cannot have a good society. So it all comes down to personal morality, which, as we know, has a spiritual root, a spiritual basis for it. John Adams put it this way: we have no government, he wrote, armed with powers capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Of course, he's talking about the Christian faith. Our Constitution, he says, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to govern any other. So when America reaches the tipping point, and no longer is this a nation of moral and religious people, Christian people, then no government can control the passions of the populace. He goes on to say, public virtue cannot exist without private virtue, and public virtue is the only foundation of a republic. Benjamin Franklin, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Otherwise, liberty becomes libertinism, moral-less liberty, basically. George Washington, the foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality. Friedrich Hayek, freedom sows the seeds of its own destruction. There's only one thing worse than freedom. There's only one thing worse than living in a free society, and that is, of course, living in an unfree society. But freedom oftentimes will degenerate into libertinism. And that's the point here that even an economist like Friedrich Hayek will honestly admit. Freedom sows the seeds of its own destruction because history teaches us repeatedly that most people cannot handle freedom. It becomes just an exercise in individual hedonism and excess. But would we trade that for totalitarianism? No. Totalitarianism is even worse because at least in a free society, some people use their freedom for good. Now, Lewis was no classical conservative, but he had very little confidence in democracy. He believed, and rightly so, that most citizens are poorly educated and most citizens are selfish. Most citizens are neither wise nor good. We see those citizens again in the news with regularity. Great quote from Winston Churchill. The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average citizen. Boy, that is sobering, isn't it? Lewis put it this way: the real reason for democracy is not that most people are wise and good, but just the reverse. Mankind is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked power over his fellow citizens. That's the argument for democracy. Now, by the way, in the appendix to the Screwtape Letters, in most editions of the Screwtape Letters, there's an epilogue, and it's an essay that Lewis wrote many years after he had written the Screwtape Letters. He writes, Screwtape proposes a toast in 1959, and this is an absolutely scathing critique of democracy as the lowest common denominator form of government, a system that rewards mediocrity. It also rewards social conformity, and that state-controlled democratic education dumbs down the curriculum, inflates grades, and coddles students while promoting self-esteem rather than true education. I mean, all of that is just right on target. According to Lewis, democracy leads to a nation without great men or women, a nation mainly of subliterates, morally weak from a lack of discipline in youth, full of the cocksuredness which flattery breeds on ignorance, and soft from lifelong pampering. And that is what hell wishes every democratic people to be. So again, it's a lowest common denominator system. Here's John Adams, again, one of the founders of the American Republic, who writes, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." Well, we're doing our best today, aren't we, in America, to commit national suicide. I'll have to overlook a little bit of this, but probably all of you have seen Alexander Fraser Tytler's cycle of history, that democratic government is prone to corruption, and you see starting at the top, here you have a people in bondage, and again, this is rather, simplistic, of course, but there's a lot of truth in this. And they gain spiritual faith and courage, and eventually are able to create a free society, which produces abundance, prosperity, which produces selfishness, because again, we do have this sin nature, which leads to apathy, complacency, dependence, where people will sacrifice liberty for security, which will lead back into a state of bondage. Now, what's a better alternative to democracy? Well, Republican-style government, which is what we were given by the Founding Fathers, where there are reasonable qualifications for participatory citizenship, reasonable qualifications for voting rights based on character, based on cultural and constitutional literacy, based on fluency in the English language, and for people that are not dependent on government. Because obviously, if someone is dependent on government, they'll vote for any and all politicians that promise the most free stuff. And reasonable protections against election fraud. Again, I know we're going over a lot of this pretty rapidly. I would refer the book to you that unpacks a lot of this more adequately. Now, as Lewis sees it, there's two great threats to Western civilization. And again, keep in mind, please, that he's writing in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And he sees one of the greatest threats to Western civilization coming through technocracy, as he calls it. In other words, an amoral, in other words, moral-less, scientific and technological industrial complex driven by secular humanistic values. Sounds like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter, doesn't it? Microsoft. And by the way, those of you who have read Lewis's Space Trilogy, you might have noticed that the chief villain in these books is always a scientist. So technocracy. One of the great post-World War II thinkers was the French philosopher Jacques Ellul. His book, The Technological Society, which he wrote in 1954, is really quite brilliant. And in that, Lewis will argue that the cult of technology poses the greatest threat to human freedom. I accept Zoom. I think we need to make an exception there. We're not talking about Zoom classes, obviously. But he says that for scientists, technocrats, corporate executives, and stockholders, the question is always, can we do this, and how profitable will it be to do this? They seem to never ask, should we do this, or is this ethical? Lewis wrote that competing economic systems, whether capitalist, socialist, or communist, share one thing in common. They are essentially materialistic and amoral. Now, again, everything human beings do is shades of gray. There's a lot of problems with capitalism, always has been, always will be. But again, we're talking as adults here in shades of gray. And capitalism, generally speaking, not only outperforms, but actually is more moral than the socialist or the communist or the fascist alternatives, of course. But he is right that capitalism is an essentially materialistic and amoral system. Whatever works and whatever will produce the most revenue is generally the guiding principle. Now, technology contributes to the growth of political centralization and the authoritarianism even in democratic nations. And Lewis, again, he's writing about this 60, 70, 80 years ago. The man is a sage. If we had time, I would play this 4 or 5 minute video with Ted Cruz interviewing an Ivy League. I can't remember if the man was a sociologist or what he was, but this is someone, he's interviewing someone who is an ardent Democrat who voted for Hillary Clinton, and yet this man is warning against the abuse of power by Google and Amazon and these big, these high-tech organizations that back in 2016, again in 2018, and certainly this year, will do so much to manipulate voting in America. And so it's certainly, you can of course just Google this, you know, and if you haven't seen it before, but very, very important insights into the dangers to American democracy being posed by big tech.
As I understand your background.
Uh-oh. We need to move on. So technocracy. Secondly, the emergence of a world welfare state, a great threat to Western civilization, globalism, a secular socialist new world order in which people's lives are controlled by the government. An increasing proportion of the citizenry is dependent upon government for their basic needs and desires. And so Lewis writes about this, again, 60, 70 years ago. All right, we have just a few minutes because I do want to end shortly after 8:30. So let me just make a few more points. And then if you'd like to stay on, and we'll just sort of open it up for discussion, questions, and so on, I'll be certainly happy to do that. If you do need to check out shortly after 8:30, please don't hesitate to do so. But let me make just a few more points, and then we'll close it out formally. And again, for much more insight into these issues and many other issues that we haven't had a chance to get to, I would commend the book C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Good Society to you. Let me see here. Well, you know, I'll just go as far as we can here. In Mere Christianity, the chapter Social Morality, the theme of this chapter is how natural law concepts can influence and regulate the social and political systems in what's a harmonious, well-functioning, and healthy society. And Lewis makes the case here that our society and our culture do not determine who and what we are. They do not determine our values. But of course, our society and culture condition or influence our sensibilities. Aristotle put it this way: moral principles are learned from those around us who serve as our exemplars. Like Aristotle, Lewis believes it was difficult for individuals to develop virtuous lives apart from a virtuous society. Now, this is another compelling reason as to why we should be so keenly aware and interested in what's going on socially and politically and culturally in America today. Our society does not determine who and what we are, but it does influence who and what we are, for better or for worse. Now, at this point, Lewis also addresses the issue of what about the Bible and government, and I'll close out on this point. And he is very emphatic that his idea of a, quote, good society would not be a sacralistic society. And in other words, it would not be a society in which the church tries to govern society in conjunction with the state. No union of church and state. And in fact, Lewis puts it this way: theocracy is the worst of all governments. Now, why would that be the case? Well, because all governments are horribly flawed. And let's suppose that we had some kind of a system that people thought was a Christian government. Well, nothing would destroy the credibility and integrity of Christianity more than to have a government that's supposedly a Christian government and yet has enormous flaws and hypocrisy and so on. So that's what Lewis is thinking here with theocracy is the worst of all governments. The social and political culture in which the New Testament was written obviously is radically different than the society and culture that we're living in. Theology, he says, teaches us what ends are desirable and what means are lawful, while politics teaches what means can be effective. That is not part of the purview of Scripture. Good government operates on the basis of natural law principles that apply to all of humanity, regardless of their religion and belief system. The goal should be to develop as much as possible a good society. But no society will ever be, quote, Christian in the true sense. Lewis is a self-described traditionalist, as I said. He incorporates many what we would consider conservative principles in that idea of a good society. He is not a libertarian. A good society, while protecting individual liberty within all proper parameters, would not promote immorality, hedonism, materialism, and irresponsible behavior and lifestyles. Now, again, a free society cannot control those things, but there's a big difference in allowing a certain amount of immorality and hedonism, materialism, and irresponsible behavior, allowing that as opposed to promoting. And I think if you look at the LGBT agenda, going all the way back to the late 60s when the modern movement, really began picking up steam, we'd have to concede that in a free society, there's definite limits to which you can control people's sexual urges and sexual activity. But that's different from a government and a society and a culture and an education system and a media that actively promote those values. Tolerating it is one thing for the sake of a free society. Promoting it is quite another thing. And we crossed that line from tolerating to promoting decades ago, of course. So anyway, for time's sake, I better close things out here. Again, there's much more in my book. If you have not read it, I would encourage you to do so. But with that, let's. If you have to check out, please again don't feel obligated to hang in there. But in lieu of that, let's kind of open things up. And any questions, comments you might have that are pretty much on point to most of the things we've talked about this evening. And so let's do that. And I see here on my screen Dave Tilley, and I'd love to have some of your thoughts, Dave. But anyone else that would like to join in, please feel free to do so.
Hey, Dr. Bashirs.
Yes, who's this?
Lee.
Oh, Lee. Yes. Okay. Yes.
How you doing, sir?
Good.
So
Good.
great lecture as always. And I just, something that's, you know, in these times we're living in, you covered the role of government and the, you know, the influence of Christianity on it or not. And so we're living in a society now where a large percentage of our culture, of our society, doesn't adhere to Christianity in any you know, measure or thought. And pretty much they've replaced Christianity with their religion is politics. And so how do we try to reach people with this mindset that the only hope they have in their lives is politics? Okay.
Well, let's start by making it very clear that we are not trying to force Christianity on anybody. That's you know, totally antithetical to everything the gospel stands for. But right. Having said that, and furthermore, we're not trying to force Christian morality on anybody. Christian morality, biblical morality, is for Christians. But what we can rightfully do and what we should do is hold people accountable to live as much as possible up to the standards of natural law. See, and again, natural law is universal. These are absolute moral principles that you might say are kind of the lowest common denominator of morality. In other words, these are principles that we can rightfully expect of everyone and hold everyone accountable for. And so that's where we want to be very, very clear. And that is, now, by the way, if America or any other civilization in world history truly was devoted, and if most of the people truly lived up to the principles of natural law, it would be the best society and culture the world's ever seen.
Yeah.
But Christian morality takes us above and beyond just natural law. Again, natural law, think of it as kind of the lowest common denominator for civility, decency, and so on. Does that help, Lee?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
And I'm definitely not saying we should try and like strive for a theocracy. I mean, we already see that in Caliphate Islam. So
that's correct. Yeah, that's a very good point you make. Islam is by its very nature a sacralistic religion. Actually, it's both a religion and a socio-political system.
Yeah.
And yes, under Islam, the attempt by the mullahs is to control people's lives. Let me go to Dave here and just get a response from Dave, and then we'll continue to open things up.
Yeah, appreciate that. Since you gave me the invitation to ask a question, I'm going to do so.
Okay.
My question is going to relate back to what you said last week, and also some of the conversation we had in Sunday school. So I apologize for having referred back here, but you said last week that socialism was corrupted by communism, and I would agree with that. I think that was a quote to some degree. In Acts 4, it talks about Christian socialism. And I think you refer in your book that C.S. Lewis actually said any good society would be socialistic. And I understand, I want to drill that just a little bit further, because I understand the problem. If government is socialistic, I think that's problematic.
Yes.
If in fact the scripture speaks to a socialistic society of giving, bringing in the goods, sharing equally with everyone, why is it inappropriate, or why hasn't the church become more socialistic? That's a negative word, it's a pejorative word just by saying it, but become more socialistic than it currently is. We repel from that word because we think of it in terms of governmental. But why isn't the church, rightly so, more socialistic based on the principles of Acts 4?
Yeah. That's a great issue you bring up. Okay. Think about it this way. You've probably experienced this yourself in your own personal life. And that is, if you're involved in a group or a church that is truly Christ-centered, people are constantly looking for opportunities to share with one another, even materially.
Sure.
Now, that would be pure Christian socialism. And it's pure because it's voluntary. It's totally voluntary. Now, that stands in contrast to state-imposed socialism, which requires tyrannical government and government coercion and so on. Now, again, I've always wished that Lewis didn't use that term socialism. I think I understand what he was saying, and in fact, there was a period in my life when I would have probably self-described myself as a Christian socialist, but I never believed that that government should be coercive, and I meant that I considered myself to be a Christian socialist in that I believed that that's how I believed Christians should live. And that is open with one another, loving one another, sharing with one another as the Spirit leads. But I guess the operative term and the difference, the fundamental difference in what we read in Acts and the New Testament and what socialists in modern times have tried to perpetrate is that Christian socialism was voluntary and Spirit-led. State socialism is coercive and tyrannical. And so I would look at it in that sense. One is voluntary, the other is coercive. Do you have any subsequent thoughts on that, Dave? And then we'll move on.
No, my only thought would be I'm disappointed that the church does not promote more of that than it does.
Yes.
I think that is a scriptural principle that has been negated by governmental concepts and constructs which deny the value of that. That's my biggest concern with the church currently.
Okay.
You answered it well. I just
let me just say this. In American history, you know that the major port of entry for socialism was the New Deal, and that came about as a result of the Great Depression, when churches and other benevolent institutions were absolutely overwhelmed by human needs with the massive unemployment and so on, and so that created the opportunity and perhaps at the time the necessity of the state intervening and beginning to provide resources and so on that in the past had been done on a voluntary basis by churches and Christian benevolent organizations and so on. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. I read the section in Mark, and I just want, I mean, in Acts, and I just wonder how voluntary it was. I'm not sure. It said they brought all their. I'm not sure if it was coerced or not. So,
Well, it was
you know,
highly recommended.
it was highly recommended by the early church fathers. So anyway, I'll let it go at that. Thanks, guys.
The fire brought theirs in.
There are people who lie
Yeah.
about it, and Jesus said,
Oh, Pamela, go ahead, Pamela.
talking about
We were
scripture.
talking about Dave's, sort of situation. I thought, Jeff, I thought your response was quite right. I mean, the issue between something which is done out of the heart and something which is done because it's been coerced by the state are two different things. Can I lead us in a slightly different direction? Do you mind? I think it's relevant.
Sure.
As I said, I just finished. We sort of wonder, as I think at the heart of Dave's comments is how do we get to where we are, in this issue, in chapter 9 of Brudishevsky's What We Can't Not Know, called The Public Relations of Moral Wrong. How is it that moral wrong has gained the high ground? He says, whenever some new wrong takes root in society, divorce, lewdness, abortion, euthanasia, fetal experimentation, hatred of children, homosexual equivalence, we're told that it's part of the new morality. There are two ways to think of this. According to the first view, there is a vast array of possible moralities, but only one of them is true, and the task is to figure out which one it is. According to the second view, there is the same vast array of possible moralities, but none of them is true in itself. The significance of the one we choose is conferred merely by the fact that we choose it. And then he says, I will be expected to say that the former view is correct, that there's a correct one and all the rest of them are wrong. But that is incorrect. I must disappoint. Both views are false. There is no vast array of possible moralities. Natural law is not the one true star in a galaxy of false ones. It is the only star. There's only one possible source of value judgments, one possible well from which moral duties can be drawn, one tree from which they can be plucked. The so-called new moralities do not pluck from different trees, they pluck from the same tree, but selectively. And so that the people who want to deconstruct this have only one choice. As he says, they have to go into the common morality and ransack it and find something which they can promote, right? And use it to beat down some other version. So if we say that abortion is wrong, they go in and seize on the virtue of compassion, which is a legitimate, true virtue, and they pump it up and puff it up until it becomes something which they can use to say, but you can't enforce your morality version about abortion because compassion is much more important. And so it's really interesting we have to note that as Christians, that we subscribe to this morality and that there's only really one morality, and that all of these things which are used supposedly morally to counterbalance our view are simply distortions of things which have been in our morality all along.
Yes, good point. Yeah, which goes back to the comment I made earlier, and I get this out of some of Peter Kreeft's writings, and that is we don't invent new moralities.
Mhm.
The only, in fact, frankly, there's nothing new, but if we think something's new, it usually is merely a negation of a moral principle. So, but if we signed on to the evolutionary paradigm, see, if you buy into evolution, not only do you well, basically, if you believe in evolution, you believe that even humanity and human nature is transitional. What human beings are today will be vastly different from what human beings will be 100,000 or 500,000 years from now. So that promotes this idea that there are no fixed points, even when it comes to human nature, let alone morality.
That's true.
Well, I have great respect for Dave and his perspective, and there are things about stuff which flies under the flag of social justice that I think are legitimate things. I can support them, but I can't support them. I can't support them from the perspective from which they're put forward.
Right.
I have to respect them by going back to the larger perspective of social of overall natural law and
Yes.
trying to understand where they would come from and where they relate in the overall picture of things. They don't become the single most important thing that we can, like the abortion choice becomes the most important thing, and choice is a moral virtue, and you have to. Yeah, but a choice of something which involves the death of children is not really a moral virtue. That's choice distorted.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we know that the secular left, Marxism, and this was true of Nazism, all these other abhorrent ideas as well. They are masters of deceit. They are masters of corrupting our language, taking key terminology and twisting and distorting it to suit their agenda. And of course, George Orwell wrote about this in Animal Farm. Huxley wrote about it in Brave New World, and so on. And so the Bible is absolutely full of social justice themes. But these are not Marxist ideas. Marxism is a perversion. The book of Amos, one of my favorite Old Testament books. I mean, so that's where I think as Christians we need to be, as cautious as possible in denigrating something like a term like social justice. The Bible is full of it. What we need to be clear about is we reject the way social justice has been perverted and distorted by the secular left.
I think, Jeffrey, if I can say that, just, and then I'm going to shut my mic off here, is that it's been said for a long time that Marxism is a Christian heresy. And the reason for that is because Marxism promotes a kind of perfectibility of man,
yes,
which we know in man's fallen state is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and was only going to happen in end times, when we're
right.
perfected, although we can work toward it, through our various and sundry devotions and so forth to try to get better and better. But we're not going to make a perfect society.
Yeah.
But Marxism pretends that we can do that here on Earth, and that's what makes it a heresy.
Yeah, and
yeah.
yes.
I have something to say. I thought that that was a good question that Dave asked, and as I'm thinking about it and how we've gotten to how the churches have gotten to where they are today, or a lot of them have gotten to this point, it seems to me like the more government takes over and does things for people, and the more there's other organizations that are doing that, then sometimes it comes down to when you see that somebody has a need, you think, oh, well, they can just go over here and sign up and they can get free food.
Sure.
Can get food for their children at school. They've got free and reduced lunches, and all of these different things. And so as Christians, we stop thinking about how we're responding and how we're acting when we see a need. I know I'm always surprised at some of the neighbors. Sometimes, I'll take them some cake or something and they'll be like, oh, this is so nice of you. It's kind of like a shock to everybody's system because people don't do so much of that anymore because there are so many needs that are being met in other ways. But then when there are people that need things, we've gotten away from even thinking about it. I think
that was my point about the the government stepping in during the Great Depression.
Well, and when I was growing up, my family came from a very poor area of Kentucky. It was a new, every time I'd go, I think, wow, we have so much. And they didn't have running water. They had outhouses. They had a pot under the bed if you needed to go in the night. You know, no bathrooms, no running water at all. You know, you just bathed, you know, from a pan of water. And, but when it came on Sundays, they brought together food for everybody on the grounds, and they shared what they had. And, you know, it was a totally different experience going to this little country church. So I grew up seeing such a difference, and difference in my family, even taking in my aunt who never learned to read, had difficulties, and that's what sent me into teaching. I shared my bed with my aunt, and she had major problems, learning problems and communicating. But we had a real, you know, the Lord used her to help me see what I wanted to do.
Well, okay, I guess there's a lesson to be learned here, and that is our sensibilities and our responses need to transcend just our immediate circumstances. We live in such an incredibly prosperous society. I have heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but I have read that the average American ranks in the top 1% globally in terms of income and so on. And so, you know, that's a great blessing in many respects. But on the other hand, we want to be very cautious about being, and again, prosperity doesn't determine how we live our lives, but it does influence it. But we need to be calling all these matters into question, our lifestyle, our priorities, and so on. Other comments?
Jeff, can I say a couple things?
Yes.
First, I was going to go in sort of chronological order of just some things that came to my mind as you were going, but I jotted some notes. But I'll start by going with the thing that Dolly was talking about, the culture of dependency that our government has created for us to live in now. And, you know, I think it's been shown multiple times and pretty convincingly that conservatives, especially Christians, are the biggest givers in this country.
That's right.
There are, of course, the multi-billionaires like Bill Gates that kind of stand out, and people like that have a huge amount of money. But as far as giving is sacrificially and consistently, it's the Christians that are the givers, and conservative Christians will say. And so this is why when people's tax records are examined, for example, the Clintons, when Bill Clinton was going to run for president, and Al Gore, and it's the same is true with Joe Biden. You know, they don't give. They assume that their philosophy is they tout you know, helping all these people out, but not them personally. No, it's a collective giving that must be done. So it's a totally different viewpoint, and we can stand out in that way, as you say. I want to say that the spectrum of political philosophy that you started off with in the early part of your talk, I see that misunderstanding almost every day, either deliberately or just by lack of understanding. People putting communism on one end of the political spectrum and fascism, Nazism on the other end. And so he called them evil twins. I called them feuding cousins. You know, they're based in they get a wash. I mean, communism gets a buy because the left likes it, the media likes it. But the thing, of course, is that as bad as Nazi Germany was, communism in China and Russia killed far more people in the 20th century than Nazi Germany ever did.
That's right. The greatest mass murderer in all of human history is Mao Zedong.
Followed by Stalin.
Next was probably Stalin.
Probably Stalin.
And yeah, when I think when we look at communism and Nazism, these are like rival gangs. These are like,
right. That's right. Like, and they acted like that in the streets of Germany before World War II. They were thugs against each other. Right?
You know, they're all thugs, but they're just rival gangs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was going to mention the book Intellectuals by Paul Johnson. I was thinking about that as you were talking about Marx. If you don't know Paul Johnson, he's a conservative historian. He's, I think, Catholic and British. He's written a lot of good history books, but Intellectuals is a short book. But in there, he focuses on people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's sort of like a beginning person in the history of socialistic philosophy and stuff. But the thing that all these people had in common, including Karl Marx, every one of these intellectuals, which he defines as somebody who pays a lot more attention to ideas than people, that every one of these people knew how the whole world should run. They had an idea for how you should live your life, but you know what? They couldn't live their own life. No. They were totally disasters as far as having a happy, successful, flourishing personal life. They were terrible with their families and other people.
Well, I might add that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, throughout much of his adult life, was a professional gigolo. He was. He really was.
Yeah.
At least he was good at something.
I thought about when you were talking about natural law and you showed Justice Thomas, I thought about the movie Created Equal. And in there, if you watch that or if you've seen it, you'll remember the segment where they showed Joe Biden back before he started to have dementia, I think. But he still was, he did this thing, if you can see me, it's like pointing at you, I see you, you see me, it's like, we're talking about this thing, you know what I'm talking about, I know what you're talking, nobody else in this room understands what we're talking about. And what he meant was the issue of natural law and how that would play out in an abortion ruling.
Right.
But he couldn't even express it in words. So he hadn't gotten much better over time.
Well, remember that prior to Clarence Thomas, Robert Bork,
right,
who many legal scholars believed would have been the intellectual leader on the Supreme Court. But Bork was rejected by the Senate.
Right.
Specifically.
Yeah. Well, Biden was going to give him up, was going to let him in, but then Teddy Kennedy stirred things up, and that sort of was the end of that. They had to.
Well, a lot had to do with Bork being a defender of natural law.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to point out that just this week, I think it was Al Mohler, when you talk about technocracy, I'm not sure if it was that author you were mentioning, but he said somebody had a theory about technology and science, which basically was, if it can be done, somebody's going to do it. And we see that now going on with the genetic technology, the CRISPR technology, scientists in China doing things that are just terrible, have terrible potential.
And that's why I mentioned Jacques Ellul in his book, The Technological Society, because Ellul would argue that's really not the main question. The main question is, should we be doing this?
Right. Yes. Nobody asks that question.
Right to do
or
it.
even if they do, there's always somebody who ignores it. So, and finally, I'll just say, I just had to think this when you were reading those quotes from the founders of our country and the basis of it being a moral, Christian, virtuous society, that, that was a prerequisite for our government working in our Constitution. It just made me raise the question in my own mind, well, heck, maybe we need a new Constitution.
Oh my.
Well, it could be bad, but I mean, I'm just saying, it doesn't fit, our Constitution does not fit our current really very well, the way things are going, right? I mean,
Lord have mercy. Can you imagine what a new constitutional convention?
Depends on who wrote it, right?
Circus, what a circus that would be.
Yeah, it could be terrible, but I'm just saying.
Well, we better check out, and thanks, Paul, for all that. That was very helpful.
Okay, I'm muting myself.
Okay, well, we better check out now. And again, thank you for your involvement. Thanks again to Kit and to Andrea and to Bruce and their technical support and all. And I'm not being modest. I'm just being absolutely honest when I say I don't think I could have navigated this evening in my PowerPoint presentation without their assistance. So anyway, thank you all. And again, I would encourage you to read the book C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Good Society. There's a lot of content in that I think you'll find to be extremely valuable. But for time's sake, we need to move on next week into American Crisis. So Have a blessed and productive week, and looking forward to reconvening next Wednesday night. Thank you.